Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, why is government debt not such a big problem, while private debt is? We know mainstream economists, and in particular politicians, point to government spending as something that needs to be reined in, otherwise we get hit with massive repayments that soak up all the money that could be used on useful things. So, why are they wrong on this? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Steve, Joh Madden has sent us a message saying he wants to understand, in simple terms, why the interest payments on public debt are not a problem. He points out how it's used to justify austerity because it intuitively makes sense to waste less money on paying interest. And he wants to know why this interest is not a problem and what if the money which the public owes keeps rising. So let's start with Theresa May, November last year, saying that we spend nearly £50 billion in payments on interest in the UK to those we have borrowed from as a result of the legacy, of course, of the Labour Party. So maybe step by step, let's start with who would they have borrowed from. That first step is, of course, when the government needs money, they get the Bank of England to issue bonds, or gilts, as we call them over here. So take it from there, in simple terms.
Okay, well, let's just further down the road. Let's start in Parliament House, because this is where the whole thing begins. Because the government will come up with a budget, where the budget estimates what they think its spending is going to be, and of course they've got fairly good estimates on spending because, except for the impact of unemployment benefits, but they've got estimates of spending. They have estimates of taxation. There'll be a gap between the two. So what the government will do is tender its I've forgotten the term that's used in supply bill. Is the term we use in Australia. I imagine it's the same here. The bill for supply, and the bill for supply, as well as saying this is what we expect for tax and our expenditure, the gap between the two, the bill is to authorise the issuance of bonds to cover that gap.
Yeah.
And that's stage one. Okay, so let's say
in most people's minds, people understand that, and they would then say, so people buy those bonds and they expect a dividend on those bonds, and so that's the cost of servicing that debt. Yeah,
okay, that's the overall perspective. Now, I'll take the simple approach, and I might try a slightly more complicated vision of this later, but what the government then does is the bonds are issued. Now, as soon as the bonds are issued, and this is if you and I decided to issue Steve bonds or Phil bonds, we couldn't go shopping immediately with the money. We could not credit our bank accounts with the amount of the bonds we issued. The government's different. As soon as the bill is passed, the Bank of England now regards the Treasury as having that money in its account. So
right. Hang on a sec. Yeah. Hang on, because we're doing this step by step.
Yeah.
I issue bonds. People give me money for those bonds. Why can't I spend that money straight away?
No, people haven't. You haven't sold them yet.
No,
okay. Cool. Before you sell them,
there's that slight problem.
That slight problem. Okay. You got to sell them. Okay. Okay. Now the government doesn't.
And no one would want to buy them.
Damn.
But exactly. But government bonds, different story, because you know you're going to get the money.
That's
back.
right. Okay. So what the central bank does is said, okay, we're going to treat your bank account as if those bonds have already been sold. So you just keep on spending. Oh. Then the bonds are sold. Now, when the bonds are sold, they are sold normally to institutions in the financial sector. Okay. So. Okay, if the government spends all those, sells all those bonds to the financial sector, then the financial sector gains bonds, and the government gets money from the financial sector. So there's no creation of money going on there because there's a transfer of money from the financial sector to the government. Now, with that money in its hand, the government then spends, and that money then goes to let's say the real economy. Now, in the real economy, with the buying and their profits and wages, et cetera, people then end up buying financial instruments to try to save money, which means the dollars, the pounds, then reaccumulate back in the financial sector. And the government repeats the process because I've ended up with a more complicated description to begin with, but what you have is a circulation of money. If you imagine what's going with the government, let's say it's just a £10 billion issuance of bonds. So the government sells £10 billion worth of bonds, and it's spending 100. So it's spending 90 out of tax revenue and an extra 10 out of selling the bonds. So it's sells £10 billion worth of bonds to the financial sector. The financial sector transfers £10 billion to the government. Over the year, the government then spends £100 billion per year, dimensioned by time, per year spending, and the private sector then goes back and saves another 10 billion of that. So you get 10 billion pounds reaccumulating back in the financial sector, and the government then repeats the process. So what you've got effectively by the bond sales is the government is stopping that money accumulating in the financial sector, taking it out by exchanging the money for bonds, and the money intends being spent through the whole economy again. So you've got in that sense, that the main role the bonds are playing is to continue the circulation of the money that's already been created before the government issued those bonds. So it's a circulation of money. That's the first stage, yeah.
Right, okay, well, let's make sure we're right on that first stage, because we're all on the same page. So the government's got a £10 billion pound shortfall, for example. It issues £10 billion worth of bonds. They get that money straight away, and that money is pumped into the economy and ends up with us, normal people. And a chunk of that money that we then get, we use it to buy stuff. But some of that we also say we want to save some stuff. We want to start saving some money. So that goes back into the financial sector, and the financial sector uses part of that to pay off some of these bonds that they've been buying.
Yeah, well, it's a circulation process. So what you're doing by issuing the bonds is making sure the existing amount of money continues turning over. If you don't do that, if the government spends 100 billion per year, and of that 100 billion, people are saving 10 billion per year, then your money stock is falling by 10 billion pounds. In terms of the active money stock, the money stock actually turning over in the economy is falling by 10 billion pounds per year. So the sale of the bonds is actually necessary to keep the circulation process going. Now, this is, believe it or not, this is a recent insight, and I can actually thank Stephen Lawton for making me realise it. I sent him the haiku diagram. He described the diagram as being obviously from my cubist phase, but in looking at it, a large part of that bond sales is no money creation going on, because you're simply selling the bonds to the financial sector and they're handing over money which is accumulated in the financial sector. But unless you do that, the active money circulation declines. So a large part of the bond sales actually is to keep the existing money stock turning over and continuing being created. Now, the question, of course, we've got to get to next is, okay, that's the circulation of money. What about the interest payments?
Yeah, well, that's it, because they still appear as a line on the government's budget. So because the government is having to pay those interest payments on those bonds. Well, it's actually paying the dividends on those bonds.
Yep. But the way that, if you imagine that let's say, there's a 10% rate of interest, which is much higher, of course, than actually applies, but it rounds out our figures. So when you issue those 10 billion pounds worth of bonds, you're also promising to give the financial sector a 1 billion pounds per year flow of interest on those bonds. Now, where do you think the money comes from?
Well, we're not going to give you an answer to that now, because you've got to listen to the full version of this podcast to follow through this story about money creation and why it's not terribly important that we have government debt. To hear it all, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen at Patreon on patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. If you provide $10 or more support per month for Steve's work, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. So hopefully we'll see you back here very soon to hear the full episode of this podcast. Thanks for listening.